How's everybody doing? Good. At ASU, they measure performance based on retention and growth. So I see that recognizable faces from last week, which means I didn't offend anybody too much. And I apologize if I did. Thank you for the grace of coming back. And see a number of new faces here today. Last week, I introduced myself by saying that I'm a professor of rhetoric, and I specialize in modern rhetoric in particular, which means I spend a lot of time thinking about why people do what they do, what motivates them to act in particular ways, why groups form the way that they do. Modern rhetoric is, in a nutshell, accepts the possibility that people act in ways that they're not always aware of, if that makes sense. So sometimes we dip into like behavioral economics and language theory and literature and all sorts of fun things. So if you have any questions about any of that, you can feel free to ask me, and I will probably try to give you a good explanation. But if you really want a good explanation, ask Wes, because he has a PhD in rhetoric also at a better university than I went to, and he knows a lot more and is a lot more wise. So he knows what he's doing. When I taught a class last spring, was it, on listening, we had, I think, a lot of folks, just the nature of our church and how the kind of weeks kind of unfold. Some people are able to come some weeks and some people aren't able to come others, and then we had folks who were able to come all the way through. But what occurred to me is, just best practices in teaching is to just go over a little bit of what we talked about in the previous class session so that you would understand where we're headed and what we're going to talk about today. I'm actually really excited to share a couple of stories with you and talk about the technology, how church life is changed by digital technology. It's something that's been on my mind for a long time. As I presented last week, the first week was going to be a question of who am I? How does digital technology comment about who I am as a believer? This week is going to be about who are we as a church in relationship to digital technology, and next week will be who is God in relationship to digital technology. So unless anybody has any questions, should we begin? You good? You're all happily eating. Okay, I'll just talk. So there are 5 main points that I wanted you to walk away with after meeting last week. For those of you who are new, this will be a quick recap. It's on the original notes from last week, or the first 2 pages, and then the second or the third and fourth page are what we're going to be doing today. So the first and most important lesson is that digital culture and digital technology are not the same thing. Digital technologies such as smartphones and computers facilitate the formation of digital cultures, but they do not determine the cultural practices that form around them. This is a really, really important point. I told a story last week about how I was sitting on a bus when I was a master's student getting ready to go teach a writing course, and a woman stopped me and said, "Are you going to fix the kids' text talk? They're using these texting, and it's ruining their writing, and it's ruining their language." And I said, well, it's evolving their language for sure, but whether or not they're obligated to use that is an entirely different thing. And I talked about how my mom, when she was alive, would oftentimes send me the LOLs and the OMGs and all of the kind of peculiar things. And I found it interesting because you would typically associate that kind of talk with a younger generation, but my mom clung to it in a different kind of way than I did. Obviously, now we're communicating more with like emoticons and that type of thing, and it becomes a way of interacting and interfacing with one another, but there is no necessary relationship between the technology and what we do with it. So what that means, practically speaking, is we need to think actively about how habits we might have had before the technology came into place are showing up. And if that's the case, then maybe there's kind of a long-standing practice of behavior that we need to address and not blame the technology for. That's the key. I don't want you to blame the technology for the things that emerge in digital culture, because I think that there is blending between what happens in digital culture and outside of digital culture. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Number 2, digital culture often presents digital technology as if it were human. So from iPhones to iPads to iMacs, notice the repetition here, I'm a rhetorician after all, to various other media technologies, marketing firms want audiences to view digital technologies as core parts of ourselves. So if you go over and turn the page over and you see I put up some of the Apple advertisements here because I think they're just generally more interesting than a lot of other kinds of advertisements. But you can see here that there's an active attempt to blend human life and digital technology. Now the reason why is because it makes good sense. I don't know if anybody has ever lost their phone. I have, and it stirred up a pretty significant form of panic because I don't have a way of connecting. I imagine, given your kid's age, if you took away their phone, if they have a phone, I don't know if they do, but if you took away their phone as a kind of punishment, that would be worse than just about anything else because they would feel a fundamental disconnection. The challenge is always remembering that while human beings adapt very well to digital technologies, and my former dissertation advisor and I talk about this regularly because I'm currently, as I mentioned last week, working on an artificial intelligence project as it works with certain kinds of writing technologies. We adapt well to certain kinds of things, but they're not who we are. We are not defined by them. They inflect who we are, for sure, and Wes gave a really helpful kind of heuristic for thinking about that. Sometimes we think about them as tools and they extend us, but sometimes, we think about them as extensions of culture and they bleed into the way that we think and talk and act. They become like techniques. Does that make sense to everyone? And so if you find yourself in a situation where you're saying, how much is technology influencing me? You might pay attention to what kinds of technology-based languages show up in the way you describe yourself to other people. You will no doubt hear me, because I'm an administrator and busy, and I'm a parent and a husband and a son and a churchgoer and everything in between, it seems. I also drive a minivan, which is the thing that I'm least excited about, but
You are your technology.
Yeah, right. No, that's not funny, Wes. You will hear me, like when people make requests of me, I will always try to do my best to accommodate them, but there will be times where I say, I just don't have the bandwidth for that right now. And part of the reason why I'm saying that is because I want to make sure that whatever I give my time to and energy to, I do it to the best of my ability. And so that's a nice metaphor for explaining, like, I'm just taking up too much. It's not that I don't want to. It's just my attention span at this point has been narrowed. I don't have the energy, the time to process the thing that you're wanting me to process. Now, some people might shrug their shoulders and say, well, I think you're making a lot out of a metaphor, Kyle. That's not really that big of a deal, except we can hear how in certain kinds of language practices, I'm hardwired to do this. If you say to somebody, I'm hardwired to do something, or I don't have the requisite software to process this, you're making a proclamation about not just what you're capable of doing, but probably what you're able to do or willing to do. Does that make sense to everyone? So, we need to link up that kind of thing. Like, it's important to pay attention to those kinds of things, in large part because they tell us a lot about how we use technology to frame the world around us. So if you find yourself catching yourself using those kinds of terms, you catch kids using those kinds of terms, ask them what they mean. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But we want to make sure that when we consume technology, when we use technology to orient ourselves in the world, that we know why we're doing it. We don't want to get caught, and this is where my domain of research is, we don't want to get caught in that kind of automatic processing where we simply do it and replicate it simply because that's what's done. As Christians, we need to be very deliberate and purposeful about how we speak, about how we give testimony to other people, about how we use technologies in order to facilitate connections in meaningful ways, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today.
Last Sunday you said, I don't do social media.
Yeah.
My immediate reaction was amen.
Yeah.
And I suspect you're perhaps working through that with us as well.
Well, but here's the thing, my wife does do social media. And so what I want to try and convey is that, and she's a far better person than I am. And everybody who knows her will tell you that uniformly. The reason why I don't do social media is because I understand by virtue of my research what's happening on a formal level.
Yeah.
I'm catching rhythms of argument that I find personally despairing. In large part because I don't think that the people who are aware of what they're doing are aware of the damage they're causing. And it makes it very difficult for me to go and educate young people and be hopeful about it if I'm overly saturated by that form of communication. So I would say that social media can have a really powerful function, and I'll talk a little bit about this, but my mom passed away a little bit less than 2 years ago, and she was diagnosed with terminal cancer right in the middle of COVID. She was diagnosed earlier with breast cancer, and then it just had a really bad flare-up. But one of the things that my mom was really grateful for at the end of her life was the ability to connect with and stay in touch with people even while she was under forced isolation. And I'm grateful for her friends and other kinds of family members who would drop her quick notes. Now they did it with text, they did it with email as well, but there was a certain amount of, she didn't want to have a certain kind of interaction, especially when she wasn't feeling well, but she still wanted to feel connected to their lives. And so being able to pull up a picture of someone's children, and when she was feeling well enough to say, your kids are so cute, that helped her feel more alive. So what I want us to avoid at any given point is I want us to avoid scapegoating digital technology when we see things that emerge in digital technology or digital culture that we don't like. Far more probable is that the technology is facilitating behaviors that would exist irrespective of whether the technology existed. My concern with it is not that I'm not worried that anybody is going to go rail or stand on a corner and say down with technology. That we want to be Luddites. I don't really. That's not particularly interesting to me. As a rhetoric scholar, one of the things I'm concerned about is if we develop this habit of conflating behaviors with tools in ways that build rhythms where we're scapegoating things and not thinking carefully and critically about the judgments that we're forming at any given moment. Because one thing we absolutely know is that if we identify as Christians, people are paying attention to how we judge things. And they often judge us based on how we form judgments. And so that work, the work that we engage in when we form judgments and communicate judgments, needs to be very, very meticulous because it's part of our testimony as believers. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes?
Can I ask you a rhetorical question connected to that?
Is there...
Doing social media.
Yeah.
And using social media. Doing sounds to me
Yeah.
like a performance.
Yeah.
Using sounds like a tool. Is that of significance for us as Christians?
I think so. If you could give me an example of when you're using digital technology without performing certain kinds of identity behaviors, I'd be interested in knowing.
Sure. I'll tell you later.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, you're not the only one who gets to ask hard questions, Wes.
I'll text you.
Okay. Again, I'm still waiting for last week's text, by the way. Wes is asking a complicated question, and the reason why it's complicated is because it's tied into really nuanced rhetorical theory that essentially says that when we speak, we engage in certain kinds of forms of symbolic action. So a really good example of symbolic action is actually the baptism that happened today. We weren't just pouring water over the top of a baby's head. We were symbolically bringing that child into the church and making a formal commitment to educating that child. To an outside observer who doesn't believe what we believe, they'd be like, why is that like give the kid up and dry off his head? But for us, that symbolic gesture is incredibly meaningful because it is not just simply, we're not just simply doing that with a child. We are also re-articulating our commitment to a faith that we believe has everlasting implications. Yeah.
Raises just a quick question, I hope. When we talk about people being immersed in digital culture, I think
Yeah.
it's more important than technology. Is that sort of people have been baptized and they've identified so highly with that?
Yeah, I mean, identification, that's what I write about the most, is the concept of identification. And I guess what I would say is that we need to make sure that if we perform things, we can perform a lot of different things through social media. So that's why I think I'm hesitating a little bit on the binary between performing and using, because Kelly, last week I asked you a question like you're connected with your daughter because she's now for the first time living out of region. And I'm betting dollars to donuts that when you send her a text routinely throughout the day, you're performing motherhood for her.
Oh, yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And you're immersed in that form of digital culture in large part because that's a way that you can maintain a relationship that has taken 18, 19 years to build. And so I guess what I would say is that's why I'm admonishing everyone to scrutinize how we judge or form judgments about digital technologies, because for every moment that we can say, I don't want to be involved in social media because it's kind of a cesspool of really hot takes that people don't seem all that committed to except to do injury to other people, you think, but Kelly, who's an incredible mom, is performing maternity and motherhood in this moment using a technology that would have otherwise been impossible to enact, if that makes sense. So I want to, you asked me, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name.
I probably didn't tell you, okay.
Okay, so Kay asked me, she said, you're a rhetorician, what are you wanting us to learn from this class? What are you trying to persuade us of? And for me, it's precision and balance. It's really what it all boils down to. I want us to use the occasion of thinking about digital technology and digital culture to attain precision and balance in how you think about and interact with the world around you. Because certainly at any given point, you could set the technology down, you can walk away, but the need for precision and balance is still going to obtain. Yes?
Much more clear this time than last week.
Thank you, yeah.
Thank you.
I believe in revision, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, number 3. Using digital technologies has consequences for how we conceptualize our cultural lives. We say things such as humans are hardwired to, and I don't have the bandwidth for, each time indicating that digital technologies shape how we see, how we think, how we feel, how we interact with one another. So being mindful of such influence is important for evaluating how much influence digital technologies and digital cultures exerts over our lives. So again, it's this exercise. It's not bad. It's just potentially dangerous. And what we want to make sure is whenever we're assessing or forming judgments about anything, digital technology is just something that tends to produce polarizing interpretations. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to really small granular exercise like, is this showing up in the way that we speak? And in the way that we're speaking, is it showing up in the way that we conceptualize relationships or conceptualize ourselves in relation to other people? Only you can do that kind of inventory. And we're told to be in the world but not of the world. And I think that this small exercise of paying attention to how technology or digital culture language shows up in the way that you speak and interact is a really good measure for how of the world you are versus in the world. Does that make sense? Okay. 4, whenever we use digital technology or make statements about digital culture, we need to have a proper sense of scope. So let's not forget that digital technologies, among other things, are war machines. And digital cultures often sponsor extremely harmful forms of communication. If we can think about the potential threat of our attachment to digital technologies and digital cultures to our lives as Christians, we can engage them with greater care and with a stronger testimony. So as I said last week, one of the things that I did not know I was going to discover when I started writing my most recent book was that there's this campus in Princeton, New Jersey called the Institute for Advanced Study. And right after Robert Oppenheimer completed the Manhattan Project, he was commissioned by the government to go and take over this institute. It became famous in so many ways because, and I'll tell you if you ever want to hear some really fun stories about this place, I'm very happy to tell them to you. But it became a place for expatriates from Germany especially to come, like Nobel Prize winning physicists, mathematicians, etc., came to this campus and they said, look, we just want you to do your thing. You don't have to teach students. We're just going to pay for your research and give you a place to stay and do what you got to do. Albert Einstein, for example, spent a majority of his time at the Institute for Advanced Study late in his career. And one of my stories is about him, so I will tell you that fun story at another time. When I met with the family of the person that I write about pretty actively, He is now one of his sons is now an astrophysicist, a retired astrophysicist, and I asked him, his name is Anthony, but he goes by Butchie. We were sitting on the patio in a farm in Andover, New Jersey. I said, Butchie, do you remember going to the Institute for Advanced Study when you were a child? Because I had read about it. I had read the letters between his dad and a number of his friends. And he said, oh yeah, the place where they were building the H-bomb?
Yeah.
And I said, that's the one. What do you remember? And he said, well, we would go down to the basement and play with all of the spare parts that they were using to develop this digital computer that was designed to calculate the equations so that they could actually, detonate a hydrogen bomb. I said, well, tell me more about that. I just couldn't quite believe it. And he said, well, they also built, Einstein a radio out of these spare parts for his 70th birthday, which I thought was kind of a cool anecdote. But he said, it was just kind of an open secret. It was a top secret activity to the extent that they were building a weapon of that caliber. But it was also, there were a number of faculty who knew what was happening and protested actively about the work. There are a number of very influential people, Robert Oppenheimer being one of them, John von Neumann, a Hungarian polymath who really kind of shepherded the project through. But in any case, we want to make sure that we're attentive to history. Digital technology has definitely evolved since 1950. I mean, even in my own lifetime, I was sharing last week that when I started as an assistant professor in 2009, iPads were like whispering that something like that might come out. And I'm going to rush out of here and go watch the Seattle Seahawks play on my iPad as quickly as possible. Not that I don't want to spend time with you, but my daughter Zadie is so committed to the Seahawks that preventing her from seeing that would be a really massive failure as a father. So, now these kinds of touch screens are ubiquitous. One of my areas of research, I'm studying this guy right now. This is what my new book is about. I went to Cambridge, England, this past summer to study a guy named Frederick Myers, who you probably have never heard of. If anybody has heard of him, will be wildly impressed. But every single person to a person has heard about his major contribution to intellectual history. Has anybody ever heard of the term telepathy? Yeah, Frederick Myers invented it. And one of the things that he invented telepathy to try and explain how people influence each other without being fully aware. And in order to do that, he started using engineering tools. They're called dynamometers. And what he said was, like right now, let's say Wes is like trying to send me a message. Yes, okay, I got it. No text necessary later. But what he would do is he would measure the level of influence by the hand pressure that would be exerted. And because those were fractional in quality, we oftentimes don't notice them. But he developed a scientific method for measuring how we influence by pushing things. Well, he has subsequently said that when we think about human consciousness that way, we want to think about it primarily in terms of haptics, meaning how much pressure we place on something when we touch it. Every single person to a person in here, if you have a smartphone, will know that the basis of your interaction with that form of digital technology is pressure-based haptics. So this guy developed this at the turn of the 20th century. Pretty interesting. Anyway, so knowing our history tells us something. It tells us something that this is not as new perhaps as we thought it might have been. The stylus is one of the oldest things ever, and that's kind of all the rage with the iPad, whatever. Okay. Yes.
So you talked a little bit about the War Machine and Oppenheimer, et cetera, last week. And I thought about it a lot this week, and I'm wondering how you equate that with Isaiah chapter 2.
You'll have to, I don't have the entire Bible memorized, you'll have to let me know.
Swords into plowshares. Isaiah says the time will come when we will take swords and make them into plowshares.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, the computer is a war machine, as you said,
Mm-hmm.
and yet God says it can be made for good.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. I think it absolutely can be made for good.
Thank you.
We also need to be aware that it hasn't stopped being a war machine.
What else has it done? Also,
It has stuff.
It has not stopped being a war machine. Well, yes, but I mean, I think also in terms of like, even more recently, if you are paying attention to the news about the war between Russia and Ukraine and the U.S. involvement in that, part of the U.S. contribution to that has been increasingly sophisticated, like pinpoint missiles. I mean, that's all digital technology as well. So it hasn't stopped. And when you're always preempting me. Next week we're going to talk about how God remains in control and can take these things.
Oh, okay.
I will even cite Isaiah 2 and read it all week for you. In the meantime,
Sorry.
I'll properly memorize it.
Sorry
But
for stepping on your line.
no, you didn't. No, I appreciate it. You're following the trajectory of the argument. Okay, and then this is the last thing. To help develop scope and relationship to digital technologies and digital cultures, we should think about them in terms of affordances, or what does this digital technology or digital culture possibly help me do or possibly prevent me from doing? If you think about it in terms of affordances, affordance is generally a positive term. You could say, can it help me, maintain connections with people that I would not otherwise have the opportunity to talk to? Does it help me broadcast a message that I want other people to hear? Can I suddenly share my testimony in a meaningful way that I would not have been able to before? My wife and I have moved all over the country, and in the process of doing that, formed a number of different relationships, especially with different churches in Illinois and Texas especially. And one of the things that we like about technology is that it allows us to maintain those relationships. It's a powerful affordance in that regard. But the obverse of an affordance is a cost. And we want to make sure that when we identify an affordance, we're also balancing it with costs. What's the cost of being able to do the work in this particular way? Again, the point is not to say that if it does this, it is by definition abhorrent, we need to get rid of it. We just simply need to make sure that we're thinking critically when we form our judgments about whatever it is we happen to be using on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so that's last week. We have 10 minutes left. Let's talk about this week. Number one, how does digital technology help the church grow? So you'll see here an attempt on my part to begin by recognizing that digital technology has a beneficial influence on how churches form and evolve over time. Not many of you know this, or if you do, maybe you've had a separate conversation with my wife and I, but we moved here to Arizona a little over 3 years ago on July 1st of, Patty, 2019. And both of us took administrative positions. Mine was a little bit different than Patty's, because Patty became the principal of a school that my daughters attended, but she had been a principal before that point. And although I had been a writing program administrator prior to assuming this position at ASU, there's no real simulation for what it's like to teach at ASU. I went from a large program at the University of North Texas, where we served probably somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000, and now I'm running a program that serves north of 23,000. I went from overseeing the work of maybe 20 to 30 teachers, and I think we're pushing close to 200 at this point. I think the actual official number is like 174. But you see the point here. So we moved to Arizona, didn't know anybody here. As we always say, it usually takes us about 3 years to make friends. Maybe it takes less time for y'all, but we're particularly unlikable people. We forward our daughters as much as possible, and they're really cute, but Gwendolyn might steal a cupcake from you, so you better just watch out for that. And we were in the process of just starting to launch all of these new initiatives, and COVID hit. And things shut down. And there's no framework. We're still in COVID in so many ways. I think there will hopefully come a time when we have enough separation where we can kind of process and name what it is we actually went through, especially in the early days. But we were on lockdown. As educators, we were scrambling to figure out, how do we do the work that we need to do? As parents, we were trying to figure out, how do we make sure that our children are not only receiving the schooling that they need on a day-to-day basis, but also feel connected to the world around them? One of the main ways that we do that, especially when we don't have a lot of friends or haven't yet made a lot of friends, is we rely on our church. And all of a sudden, you can't go to church. And we have a 4-year-old and 2 6-year-olds who don't have any friends, who don't understand what a pandemic is. At the time, we were trying out Scottsdale Bible, and I think in so many ways they do an exceptional job, using digital technology to broadcast their message. And one of the ways that they did that was they had their youth ministry broadcast children's messages on a day-to-day, on a weekly basis, and in a way that my daughters connected with. They would look forward to it every week. They would go up and dance in front of the television. I think Patty probably documented it at some point. Yeah, she gave me the nod. Okay, so it's been documented. We may even have documentation of Patty doing some of the dances as well. We'll see if we can round up some of that footage. But in that moment where we were already vulnerable by virtue of the fact that we were isolated from anybody that we were connected with, and this is especially true because all of our family is up in the Pacific Northwest, a church was able to give our children basic messages that help them learn more about God. And we're grateful for that. Okay, so that's story number 1. Story number 2, yes?
I'd just like to say, you weren't here probably for that, but my grandson out east in New Jersey belongs to a small church, so Sunday school was just, but our church did, Miss Hillary did virtual.
Yeah.
So my little grandson in New Jersey benefited from what our church
That's
did.
amazing. Yeah.
I mean, it was a gift.
Yeah, and what a powerful testimony. Yeah, I totally agree. All right, step 2, story number 2. When COVID hit, my parents were in the process of transitioning into retirement. And at the time, when we were, this was, I guess, 3 years ago, we had property on the Oregon coast, on the same road. At a time, we co-owned a really cool house on Nancy Avenue in Glen Eden Beach, Oregon. If you ever have a chance to go to Glen Eden Beach, you should do it. It's really pretty there. And then my parents had a little trailer that they hung out at. So they had sold their house. My dad retired. They sold their house, and they retreated to the Oregon coast. And at the time, my mom, unbeknownst to us, was really sick. And my dad was doing his best. She had asked my dad not to tell anybody about what was going on with her. I was like intuiting that something was kind of off, but he was respecting her wishes. And one of the ways that my dad helped cope with her diagnosis was being connected at church. So all of a sudden, he goes from a church where he was very active in terms of service and ministry, went to another state, staying in a place where the only person he really is allowed to interact with because of my mom's health vulnerabilities was her, and had no way of regularly attending church. And so what he ended up doing was he started listening to the broadcasts of the Brooklyn Tabernacle in Brooklyn, New York. And over the course of the last 3 years has formed a relationship with the pastor. He's going to go out there in November. We actually went out there last November and went to a service. And in the process of doing that, I think formed the kind of relationship that he needed in order to weather the storm of my mom's illness and eventual death. And so we think about those moments where how can digital technologies help us form connections? Who are we reaching that we're unaware of, who desperately need to hear the message and feel some semblance of community, but might not otherwise be able to receive it? So that's story number 2. Okay. I'm going to skip story number 3 because we're running a little low on time, and I want to give us some time to ask and answer questions. But in the face of telling these stories about powerful personal and familial connections with churches by virtue of digital technology, we have to counterbalance that with some potential dangers. And I think every person in here is probably here because you have questions or concerns about digital technology and digital culture. So this first story is, how does canned laughter help us think about being a believer? I don't know if anybody does anybody recognize the name Marshall McLuhan? Yeah. Can you, those who raise your hand, tell me who he is?
Media expert, wasn't he?
Yeah, he wrote a book in 1960 called The Medium is the Message.
Yeah. Then he wrote another one that was a little bit, had a weirder title called The Medium is the Massage. I've never been brave enough to pick that one up.
I got that.
Oh,
In my shop, right in my office.
yeah. I just don't want to be massaged by Marshall McLuhan. So his famous idea is the distinction between hot media and cool media. Hot media are immersive media that don't require a lot of the viewer. You can just simply be there. So a good example that he gave was cinema. You go into a dark room, you sit in front of a screen, and it basically immerses you in a world, and there's not a lot of interaction or interfacing. Cool media, by comparison, requires a certain amount of interaction. So you could think of like a telephone as a kind of cool media. It doesn't do everything for you. Does that make sense? Okay. So a lot's changed since Marshall McLuhan wrote The Medium is the Message and The Medium is the Massage. And increasingly what we find is that our digital technologies are hot media instead of cool media. We can broadcast, for example, 4K high definition on our iPhones and become so immersed in it that we get in car accidents or forget that the person who's sitting next to us is talking to us. There's a Slovenian philosopher named Slavoj Žižek who wrote a very interesting book. I didn't recommend it to you. There's a book recommendation list if you're interested in learning more about these topics on the next page, called The Sublime Object of Ideology. And in this book, he introduces or adapts a concept called interpassivity. You don't need to know a lot about this except for it's a concept that I think about a lot. The idea of interpassivity is it tries to explain that at any given moment, the relationships that we have with one another require more or less belief from one or the other person. Okay? So the idea, for example, I'll start with canned laughter, we'll talk about toilet paper, and then I'll take it to the church. Okay? Oh, we could talk about gas if you'd prefer, not like gasoline, not the other kind of gas. And then we can talk about church. So canned laughter, Zizek says, is a very good example of interpassivity when you have had a long day at work, let's say, and all you want to do is just sit and binge a television show on Netflix or whatever channel, streaming service you prefer. One of the things that's very peculiar about canned laughter is that it's an indicator of a hot media, meaning it not only cues you to laugh, it in certain ways laughs for you, so you're relieved of the burden of having to laugh. Does that make sense to everybody? And so no one's going to be there watching you, making sure that you laugh at all the right spots. And if you just want to sit and zone out and, oh yeah, I watched the show, it was so funny, and you can actually tweet it and be like, ha ha ha, LOL, and you may not have laughed at all. Okay? It relieves you of the burden. And one of the things that Zizek argues, I think implicitly, is that our emotional lives is all about managing balances and tensions. It may take you, maybe if you're like me and you're a teacher, it takes so much belief in the value of education to get through your day that the last thing that you want to do is start believing in the value of a television show. There needs to be a kind of point of release. And yet, if we think about that as a kind of prototype or a framework for how we think about our lives as believers, we need to start being careful. One of the things that Wes said last week is that when we start broadcasting our church services, there are people who said, I like this so much, I don't ever need to come back. Okay. This to me is a version of canned laughter. Increasingly what I'm finding in the contemporary American church, and this is what I've been wanting, this has been on my heart a really long time, and so you can, take it for what it's worth, but this is something I've been thinking about, is that leadership, church leadership, is increasingly bearing the burden of belief on behalf of the church body.
Say that again.
Church leadership is increasingly bearing the burden of belief for the church body. Meaning we come down, we sit in pews, Wes or Mike or whomever is doing the heavy lifting of interpreting the word, of presenting it in a cogent way, of delivering that message, and we as consumers of it say, okay, I got it. I feel edified. I'm ready to go into the week. I think that happens whether or not there's a camera on Wes. I don't think, I've observed that dynamic happening over and over and over again. But I think it's exacerbated by digital technology. And I will tell you personally, during the pandemic, when I was watching broadcasts of sermons, I found myself, instead of doing the difficult work of paying attention, taking notes, thinking critically about what it is that the pastor was having, I started cooking. I would divide my attention. I'd say, well, this is great because now I can do multiple things simultaneously. In that moment, I wasn't bearing the burden of belief as a Christian. The thing that I want to stress, and it's actually very tight. It wasn't planned, Wes. I was paying attention to your sermon today about this peculiar parable about the steward who gets a little. I've got a sneaky little one, so I was identifying with that. I was like, "Wow, well played, Gwendolyn." She did it with a cupcake right after church. I was like, "Wow, that's the parable in my life." For that interchange to work, the steward had to have formed relationships with the people beforehand. And digital technology creates proxy, and oftentimes creates proxy relationships. We act as if we're doing the difficult work of interacting with one another, bearing the burden of belief as believers with one another, saying, "Hey, Kelly, how's it going now that your daughter is now gone? How are you feeling? Is there anything that I can do? Can I make you a meal?" You'd be like, "No, it's okay." Kelly would say, "No, it's okay. I'm good. Everything's good." But as a parent, I know that might not always be the case. When I was grieving the loss of my mother, I didn't have a church family to go to at that particular moment. And I needed someone to do the difficult work of just sharing the burden of belief. I'm not worried that my mom was a believer. I'm not worried about any of that. But in the state of grieving, it's difficult to bear that burden of belief. As a church, what I want to stress is that digital technology can broadcast our testimony, and I think we should absolutely be doing that. But that is not an end unto itself. We need to be very, very wary of the canned laughter version of church, where we are not working together as a church body to share the burden of belief in the face of increasingly dire circumstances. And my biggest worry is that when we come to rely on digital technologies as a church to communicate our message, instead of sitting down with families, meeting in person, hearing different perspectives, and doing the difficult work of negotiating those perspectives over time, with grace and forgiveness, we say, "I'm just going to give a hot take on a social media account." And to me, that's the most heartbreaking form of the testimony of the Christian church in the 21st century. Now, I'm hopeful. I will continue to carry this burden as a believer and as a scholar of media and rhetoric and so on. I am certain that even in the face of this, there are committed groups of people who do that day-to-day work, where they're interfacing with people even when it's hard, where they're bearing the burden of testimony, where it never gets seen and it never gets recognized. At the same time, I worry that that percentage is dwindling. And so this isn't really about technology, and certainly not meant to be a sermon in any case. And I want to talk with you all about this, and we're running out of time. But I want to give you an encouragement. People who study belief know that belief is hard. And anybody who takes the time to read the Gospels knows that you only sweat blood if you're going to the end of the line. We're called to take up our cross. And we need to be mindful of who Jesus ministered to, the broken, the lost. If digital technology allows us to reach them, use it. if digital technology creates a space where we don't have to share the burdens with them, then we need to rethink our relationship to digital technology. All right, that's all I got.
Thank you for joining the Fran Park Center for Faith and Life. Our mission is to serve the church and community through innovative, inclusive, and transformative education. Check out our website at www.franparkcenter.org for more information about upcoming events, programs, pilgrimages, and opportunities to get involved. If you enjoyed this program and would like to see more like it, please consider a donation. You can find more information of ways to support the Park Center on our website.